On this episode of the podcast, I have with me Dave McCann. He is the CTO at Self Financial. We're going to be talking about scaling strategies. Dave's worked at companies that are VC backed, PE backed. There's different strategies and different ways of growing. We're going to talk about what those are, what their similarities might be. He's also been a part of multiple exits, and we're going to ask him, how is that possible? Is it by design? Some people consider themselves lucky. I don't. I think there are steps and things people see that we need to understand, especially if you're going to look for a job at a startup. Everyone's trying to find that next startup that could potentially set them up for a good exit. And how do you see the trees of the forest sometimes? Dave, thanks for joining the podcast.
Yeah, I really enjoy spending some time with you today, Amir. Thank you.
Awesome. Self Financial, what do you guys do over there?
Yeah, Self's a credit billing platform. So people that have either no credit, low credit scores or things like that, Self develops a set of products and services that, really focus on their credit journey. So as people advance, in their careers or, just in life in general, we're really focused on kind of the outcomes of those people and advancing them in their credit journey. It's been a pleasure. I've been here about 3.5 years.
Awesome. And obviously, if somebody wants to, they can take a dive into your LinkedIn, look at your background. You've been a CTO, different types of companies. You've actually been a part of companies that have exited. You've been a part of different companies. And I thought this topic would be interesting because for the most part, when people think about opportunities, a lot of times it's a VC-backed startup that they think high growth. And that's not always the case. Private equity sometimes come in, buys a business with their own goals in mind. I guess from a CTO's perspective, when you're looking at the two different types of potential investments, whether it's VC or private equity, what are some of the differences, especially if you're not, well versed in the private equity side, you're more well versed in, let's say, working for startups as in VC backed?
When I think about the differences specifically in, how you grow, where you're focused, whether it be a venture-backed company or even a private equity growth company, they're different. They're just different animals, right? I think when you join a VC company, whether you're a founder or an early employee and things like that, it's really about really 3 to 4 things when you're looking at growth. One is obviously you're still in the throes of, product market fit. So is it going to be a viable product? Do you have a customer base? What's the TAM? Things like that. And you're really focusing at the end of the day is that product, going to, either grow, not grow, be a slow grower, those types of things. I think in VCs in general, especially when you're looking at an employee, looking to be employed by a VC-backed company, I think it's, over the years, I would always say it's going to be a dynamic market, like all the VCs talk about, dynamic market, large TAM, availability of the product, things like that. I really think, there's a second component of that in a VC. That early team and the combination of people, and it's not always just development or CEOs and CTOs and things like that. It's really the combination, the mix of the people. Are they aligned in kind of the goals and the values of the company? I think everybody's heard, sleeping under desks and working 50, 70 hours a week. That's part of the life of a VC-backed company, but also it's really about how do you gel with those coworkers. And, at the time, there could be 5, there could be 10, 15 people. But from a VC standpoint, those first early hires are so critical in the way they interact and the culture you build around the organization. Almost as important, 10 years ago, I would have told you the most important thing is the product, the market fit, and the TAM. Today, I would tell you that, those teams have to be really cohesive and gelled and, common goals and things like that. On the growth side, on a private equity, backed company, I think very similar patterns. You still have to innovate. You still have to, drive, external growth and things like that. But within a private equity or, a later stage company, obviously there's, product market fit, you found it, you understand, you have a customer base install. So it really comes down to how do you take a much larger organization, scale it, especially as like a CTO, like, the activities you do as a CTO, in a private equity backed company are more around, scale of the business, cost effectiveness. You really don't think a lot about cost when you're, trying to innovate and build a brand new product. As your products mature, you've got to think, how do I balance the investment in kind of our existing customer base and those products, but also at the same time, how do I keep that innovation going? And I think that pattern is slightly different in a private equity backed company, or even a late stage venture backed company. I think you end up spending a lot of time around the innovation components of it, but also the scale, the cost effectiveness, things like that. And then, I guess for me at least, as I've gotten more experience in my later in my career, I think it comes back again to the people. I think, you've had those original 10 people and you kind of went through battle with them. And then as the organization grows, a private equity firm buys it, you increase the capital, you go from 10 people to 500 people. The pattern's different, right? You really have to think about those fundamental levers of growth within the organization, around, how much money do I put into product A versus how much do I invest in product B, which is the new product. So you do a lot more math, I guess, but you also spend a lot of time, developing, kind of process, the ability to scale the organization and things like that. But I always go back to, I think, in a larger organization, as you try to retain your growth and kind of the momentum of the business, it always comes back to the people. I think while there's not 10 people, there may be 100 people in your organization. It's really about how do you keep them aligned, engaged, and on mission. And it's really about how do you motivate those people? How do you get the best out of them at the same time? So I think, while there's obviously difference in the pattern in the way that you look at VC versus PE, I think at the end of the day, it's, how do you treat your employees? How do you treat your customers? Do you do it with an integrity? Does the team kind of, grow with the organization? Is there a path for them to expand their career? That ends up being, just as important as, the next great product in an organization, I would say.
And I think, as I was listening, I was thinking about, you mentioned the early core in a venture-backed company, that you're going to find that core, they're going to grow with you, you're going to hopefully scale with them. Private equity is slightly different, but still not different, right? It's still the same thing. You still need that core. You still are going to probably have people that you're going to count on. I think I could see the commonalities, different contexts, obviously. And the one thing I started thinking about is, obviously in the smaller company as a CTO, how you have an effect, or the imprint within the culture, right? You have so much more control. There's less people, maybe still trying to find product market fit. So different mentality of what you are open to, not open to. When you think about the two, maybe, and you're looking at as a CTO, how do you help influence some of that culture, some of that excellence that you want to drive towards? Is there a difference, or just different amount of people?
I do think that there's a difference. I think I always tell everybody, when you're in a VC-backed company as a leader, you're incredibly prescriptive in what you do, right? Like, so you define kind of, look, here's where I think we're going from a roadmap. Here's the timelines around that. Here's where here's what we're gonna look for growth levers and things like that. But it's very prescriptive, right? Even with 10 people, I think you're all commonly very focused on, hey, we're getting the product to market by March, or we're going to X amount of users by this date and things like that. But they're very common kind of centered goals. I think when you're the CTO of a larger organization, when you get into the hundreds, 200s, 300s, it's really about kind of diffusing that energy out into the organization and making them more accountable and relevant. And the ideation of the organization in a healthy kind of growth company comes from the teams that are doing the work. And I think that's least in my career, what I've found is, when I was in early venture-backed companies, we all had this common goal and we were driving towards a very specific thing, moment in time, whether it be a goal or, revenue number or number of customers. I think that's, for a better word, more balanced in a private equity backed company. You kind of have growth goals, you know what they are, you've got a lot of people, you've really got to get those people enthused and organized, and projects have to be tracked in a much different way. But at the end of the day, you're really enabling people. So I think just to wrap that up in a finer point, I think as a VC backed CTO, very prescriptive. Prescriptive is not the perfect word for it, but it's really about driving kind of a common set of goals. And I think when you get into that larger organization, it's really about you're the world's biggest cheerleader. I always tell everybody you're trying to enthuse and enable people and really get the best out of them. And I think even in my career, as I've gotten more experience, that I focus on the people, I focus on enabling them, and then kind of get out of their way, which is slightly different.
No, and I think that's a great differentiation. And you've kind of gone back and forth. You've worked for both types of companies. You've been a founder, and you said as you've gone through your career, you've gotten better at being the cheerleader, getting out of the way. That is not always the easiest thing to do. And I think as you're scaling a smaller venture-backed company where you do have a lot of control, or you join a private equity firm where it's a little bit growth company, it's a little bit bigger, and you have a different focus. I think obviously if you're still the CTO of a venture-backed company, your goal is to get to that couple hundred size engineering org. And I know this wasn't the point of the podcast, but just something I was curious about is, as you kind of have gone through the two, and as you mentioned, you've gotten better at understanding to get out of the way. How do you get there? How do you start understanding how to let go of that delegation piece and be more comfortable letting things play out and give people the opportunity versus wanting to jump in, try to be a part of it? Because obviously you're going to be the bottleneck if you're always trying to jump in and solve problems anyways.
Yeah, I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head. I think that is the most incredible, or that is probably the hardest thing to do, especially coming from, a venture-backed company. You kind of will it to a certain point. I mean, you've got to have great market, great products, things like that. But at the end of the day, you spend a lot of time willing things to happen, right? Like you're in the mud with everybody. I think in a PE-backed company, obviously you kind of have to step back, like we talked about. At least for me, that was probably the biggest transition between the two. I mean, I'm sure if you talk to one of my employees, 10, 15 years ago, I was an incredible micromanager. And I think that was out of necessity, right? You're trying to get to that 1, 2, 3 goal or things like that. I would tell you, 2010, 2012, as I started, kind of the second half of my career in private equity, incredibly challenging. I mean, I would tell you the first 2 years, felt like I was a brand new employee again, trying something brand new, right? Like trying to motivate a large population and things like that. And at least for me, I really focused around kind of transparency in the process, where we were having tight timelines and schedules, and actively kind of promoting and spending a lot of time communicating with our employees. And I wasn't always good at that. To be frank, I think, it probably took me 3 or 4 years after I transitioned from kind of VC to PE to really capture the essence of being a good leader that, is focused on enabling people rather than, a goal.
I earlier I was speaking to a CTO about a topic for the podcast, and we talked about how much business acumen you need to pick up to make these transitions to help a company actually scale. And I think as from a venture back standpoint, what I've been hearing is there's a lot more proximity to the technology, to the product market fit. And as you have been talking about private equity, I'm hearing some of that business minded skill being with the finance people, with the marketing people, understanding what drives a business. I guess you were going to answer the question of making the transition as a CTO, helping these companies scale. If you had to look back, what is the 1 or 2 skills that you just would have never thought you would have to develop that, from your engineering days. You look back, you're like, I would have never saw that coming, because those are skills that I never thought were going to be relevant.
Yeah, I think there's two that, and actually, as I mentor people now, these are the first two things I start with. One is, understanding a P&L and understanding the levers, especially on the technology side. So, when you have a single product, you have $10 million in the bank, and you've got to make a product mix that you really don't spend a lot of time on the P&L, right? Like, it either works or it doesn't. When you get into a private equity based company, or later stage growth where you've got hundreds of people, the P&L matters, right? And being able to understand that as a technologist, it just wasn't a native skill to me or to the people. So I spend an enormous amount of time now. I always bring up an old P&L, and I walk, our early directors or our software developers that are interested in becoming leaders. I always, said that's the first thing I do. So instead of getting into the technology and the platform and things like that, I go, here are the mechanics of, how a technology organization runs. And here's what good looks like when it comes to investment in technology versus, cloud or hosting and things like that. So it's really around getting that balance. And for the first 10 years, I had a fantastic CFO that I worked with for years, and he did all that. But as the organizations got larger, I really had to focus on, the math behind the technology and things like that. That was one. And then, the second thing I think is, strategically or much different is, again, I default back to, the way you engage your employees and the way you engage your customers and things like that. You have to be more of a servant leader, later in a later stage company, because, these people's motivations early when you're 5 people, 7 people, things like that, everybody's motivated to get an excellent outcome, a product to market, things like that. People's motivations change. And as the organizations get bigger, you get a variety of people that are motivated by different things. So you really have to, it's work, right? Like, one of the work streams when you go into a private equity backed company is building the culture. And you can't build a culture, but you can certainly, demonstrate what you think is a great world-class culture. And I think that's a major difference too.
Absolutely. I like the way you articulated that. I know we talked about scale. I mentioned exiting. I was going to kind of go through, I have your LinkedIn open. I'm going to go through because I want to ask you a question that I think could be beneficial for everyone here. So going back through your career, you've been a part of a company that got acquired by Sun, then which is now part of Oracle, Dell, Logitech, Primus, TPG, Fortive, Carlyle Group, and then obviously now itself. That's a pretty good track. I actually had a founder on who had 6 exits, and I go, this is not by accident. You see something. Not everyone can see it. You see something particular. 1 time, 2 times, I'm like, okay, fine, you get lucky. But when it's consistent, you see an opportunity. And I think a lot of times when people are joining a venture-backed company, a private equity, they're hoping for an exit. It doesn't always happen, but when you do see somebody who has gone through multiple serial exits or been a part of them, you start seeing that they have a knack of seeing what kind of businesses have that ability. And not to say that, this is a hard and fast rule, but just out of curiosity, given your track record, when you evaluate a job, whether it's just, as being a co-founder, venture-backed, private equity, when you look at that type of scenario, are there signs, are there things that you look for? Don't say you got lucky, because I'm not going to believe it.
I think it's around the right choices at the right time. So obviously, you have to time these things. I think, from a venture backed, I think early in my career, I didn't have a pattern, right? I didn't look for things. I had the first company I went to work for, I had the opportunity of having some really great co-founders that had been in the market for 10 or 15 years. And I was the kind of young upstart person. But at the end of the day, they taught me to have discipline. And I think specifically within VC companies, I look for a couple different things. One, obviously, kind of the investor. And I don't think VCs think about that as much. I think founders think about that, but I don't think early employees do as much. And I think, having a great VC or a good financial partner will will dramatically improve kind of the odds, if you will, of having, success. I didn't think about this when I was early on, but, the people, again, going back to kind of the people, it's those critical 5 or 6 hires. Are they motivated? Are they kind of swimming in the same, direction as you? Those are two things. And then, I think there is a little bit of where the market is. Like when I came out of school, it was, I don't know, 1997, the world was on fire, everybody was making money, things like that. And then it dramatically changed in, 2001, 2002, where, you really had to differentiate yourself as an employee. And I think that is a compelling, those things are compelling in a VC. When I look at later stage growth companies like, private equity or even public companies, it's really about kind of, at least for me, I always look for a company that's, and this is very prescriptive to me, but I like companies that are, 50 to $150 million in revenue because they still have time to grow. I understand from an executive leadership standpoint that I can still make an individual impact. When you're that size, you're not a startup, but you're still nimble, right? And you can still move around and make, you can go out and make a great product. Stuff's a great example. We continue to innovate, and there's not a lot of bureaucracy or anything like that to it. So we really focus on, here's the outcome, here's what's going, and then, you apply kind of the scale and things like that to it. So I think, at least for me, early on, it's about the team, the product, and the people. As you get, longer, more into the kind of the growth businesses, I really focus on, does that pattern look the same as the success I've had in the past? And I don't think any company is the same. Every company that I've worked for has, been, I always tell everybody there's 20% of the company that's exactly like the last one you worked at. And then 80% of it is completely different. You got to learn all over. But, as an employee, I always look for, right market fit, kind of the size. Like if I'm, I'm not great, like, when my organizations get to be 2,000-3,000 people, I don't work well. It's not success to me. So I always look for 100 employees, 200 employees, but there's definitely a profile and a pattern to those companies to pick out. And I think you develop that pattern over a period of time too.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I've always held that successful people operate with frameworks, and they tend to swing at things that fit within their framework, and they tend to walk away from things that introduce risk. And as I'm kind of listening to you, I'm like, you kind of know where your sweet spot is. You know where you're going to excel. You know yourself. You know your attributes, and that's actually helping you kind of sift through and identify those opportunities.
Yeah, I mean, I think everybody does this early, later in their career, but if I had a defined pattern and kind of knew what success looked like for me, I would have always selected that. I didn't get lucky, but I evolved. I guess my idea of a great profile of a company has evolved as I've gotten older.
I guess it's just a curiosity. When you look at venture-backed VC companies, you see the attraction for a lot of people, especially early stage employees. They can see it because it's talked about, going to work for a VC backed company. When we talk about going to work for a PE growth company, I don't know if it's the same view or the same vantage point, or the opportunity is the same to somebody who thinks of, oh, I got to join a startup to get that growth. Obviously, you've been a part of different PE backed companies. Can you maybe just talk about, so and the reason I'm asking is I think a lot of people know, hey, I go work for a startup backed by a great, VC, that's obvious. But when you look at the PE opportunity, I think it'd be good for people to understand that there is an equal, or similar, if not better, opportunity for that type of exit if you know what you're looking for.
Yeah, and I think, there definitely, and I think, especially when, earlier in your career, when you have less experience, you're really, you shouldn't be, but you're really focused on wealth creation, right? You want to be able to, continue your career and get a house and do these, all these great things. I think when you get later in your career, again, you look for a pattern, right? You look for, What size is it? What market is it? Is it thoughtful? What does the leadership team look like? I think those things. I would tell you that I think private equity backed companies have a lot more structure, obviously, to them, but I also think that they have a more inevitable pattern, right? Like people really look for, well, like we're gonna buy this company, we're gonna, for better or worse, we're either gonna turn the innovation back on or we're gonna continue the innovation. We have some legacy products, we need to redo those, and I think that complexity intellectually is very interesting, but at the same time, it's a pattern that you can develop, whether it's facilities management software or a B2C consumer app and things like that. When it comes to those later stage growth levers, as an employee, you can, there's still a lot of wealth creation left there, right? Obviously, the investors wouldn't have spent money in that. But at the same time, there is a pattern, there is a feel for these businesses where, they're a certain stage, they're a certain size, there's that 20% that we talked about where you say, 20% of the same. It's probably more in a VC, it's probably, or in a private equity company, it's probably, more like 40-60, where you have 40% of it where you have to do, look, I've got to hire, as a CTO, I've got to hire a great centralized PMO. And that PMO is going to be 4 or 5 people, small organization, but it's organizing across multiple products because we have, connections between them. Those patterns are just more advanced and I would say less risk averse as well, right? Like I think it's probably fair even to say that, in a private equity or a late stage growth company, I think your ability to drive growth really comes down to bigger levers. And, like, look, I can cut cost here. I can, move money over here to advance this product while this one, maybe gets less attention and things like that. So I think for me, that was like, at least for me, when I was looking at jobs and, I got into private equity for kind of late stage growth because my company got acquired. That was a big lesson learned of, hey, how do you, these patterns are completely different than the patterns that I did for the last 10 years. So how do I adapt to those and what are the growth drivers and, what's an attractive business? I think those things are much different.
Awesome. Yeah, I mean, you a ton of advice and insights. I don't think we obviously exhausted the topic. Somebody might have a question because we haven't even tapped your full knowledge on this. I can only do so much in 30 minutes. But if somebody does want to reach out to you to have a follow up or something that came to their mind in terms of this concept of a VC private equity, is there a way to get in touch with you?
Yeah, absolutely. LinkedIn's probably the best professionally way. Just reach out to me on there, or I am active on social media, so like Twitter and things like that. And I take a lot of time and effort to try to talk to new employees or mentors and things like that. So anytime anybody wants to talk, I love this subject. I love kind of the patterns. We'll leave it at that.
I love it. Dave, thanks for being on. Thanks for sharing. I really do appreciate it.
Amir, I really enjoyed it. Have a great day.
Absolutely. You too. That's it for the episode. Be back again. Different guest, different topic. Until then, 2 things. One, I do think a lot of times when we talk about VC venture-backed companies, I do think everyone is more familiar with them. So I really like the fact that Dave was able to talk to us about the PE side, understanding the differences, some of what he sees as a CTO scaling both exit strategies, his framework and what he used in his career and how it developed. So I think a lot of these are great insights that hopefully you can share with somebody else that may be also interested. So please do that. Also, like, subscribe, comment. Let me know how the podcast is going for you. Until next time, thank you and goodbye.